13th September 1942, Central Stalingrad. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 94th Infantry Division pressed his back against what remained of a brick wall, his hands trembling as he gripped his Mauser K98K rifle. Somewhere in the darkness above him, maybe the third floor, maybe the attic, a Soviet sniper waited. Hoffmann had watched 3 of his men die in the last hour, each shot through the head the moment they exposed themselves. The building they were trying to take was supposed to have been cleared yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. It was just one building, 4 stories of shattered concrete and twisted metal on a street whose name he couldn't pronounce. But his company had been fighting for this single structure for 9 days. 9 days! In France, they had conquered entire cities in less time. One sergeant, a veteran of the French campaign, had muttered before a sniper's bullet found him. In Paris, we advanced kilometers per day. Here, we measure progress in meters, sometimes in corpses. The building still hadn't fallen. Hoffmann would be dead in 3 days, his body joining hundreds of others in what the soldiers were now calling the Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done facing an enemy who turned every room into a tomb? This is the story of Stalingrad, not simply as a battle, but as the place where Nazi Germany's unstoppable war machine collided with a new and terrifying form of warfare that would break it. Here, in the ruins of a Soviet industrial city along the Volga River, the Wehrmacht discovered that all their tactical brilliance, all their combined arms doctrine, all their blitzkrieg experience meant nothing when the battlefield was reduced to rubble and every staircase became a death trap. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. The Soviets called it hugging the enemy. History would remember it as urban warfare in its most brutal, intimate, and psychologically devastating form. This is the story of how a city became a nightmare that consumed an entire German army. The path to catastrophe began with confidence. By August 1942, Nazi Germany's war machine appeared unstoppable. Operation Blau, Case Blue, had smashed through Soviet defenses in southern Russia with devastating efficiency. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group South had driven hundreds of kilometers across the steppes, encircling entire Soviet armies, capturing vast territories. Panzer divisions raced forward under the merciless summer sun, their tracks churning through golden wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. The objective was clear: seize the Caucasus oil fields that fueled the Soviet war machine. If Germany controlled Baku's petroleum reserves, the Red Army's tanks would stop rolling, their aircraft would be grounded, and Stalin's regime would collapse. But Hitler, never satisfied with purely military objectives, allowed symbol to override strategy. Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial city of 600,000 people stretching 40 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga River, bore Stalin's name. The Führer became obsessed. Taking Stalingrad would humiliate the Soviet dictator, provide a propaganda victory that would echo across the world, and secure the northern flank for the drive into the Caucasus. On 23 July 1942, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 45, splitting his forces and making Stalingrad a primary objective. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the 6th Army, received the order: take Stalingrad. Paulus was 52 years old, a tall, aristocratic staff officer known for his methodical precision and unwavering loyalty to orders. He had never commanded an army in actual combat before this campaign, but he now led one of the Wehrmacht's most powerful formations, over 270,000 men, supported by the 4th Panzer Army, hundreds of tanks, and massive Luftwaffe support. His soldiers were veterans who had conquered Poland, France, and vast stretches of the Soviet Union. They expected Stalingrad to fall within weeks. On 23 August 1942, the Luftwaffe launched one of the war's most devastating aerial bombardments.
Wave after wave of Heinkel H-111 and Junkers Ju-88 bombers turned the afternoon sky black, dropping thousands of tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs on Stalingrad. Entire neighborhoods vanished in fireballs. The oil storage tanks along the Volga erupted in towering columns of flame, visible for 80 kilometers. Wooden houses exploded into kindling. Apartment blocks collapsed, burying families in cellars. Over 40,000 civilians died in a single afternoon, more than would die in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki 3 years later. The Volga burned. The sky glowed orange even at midnight. Survivors emerged from shelters to find their city transformed into a landscape from hell. But the bombing, intended to break Soviet morale and facilitate a rapid German advance, had an unintended consequence. It transformed Stalingrad into the perfect defensive position. Buildings became rubble, and rubble became fortresses. Streets disappeared under tons of brick and concrete, creating obstacles that channeled German advances into killing zones. The city's
Yeremenko's question was blunt. "Comrade Zhukov, can you hold Stalingrad?" Zhukov's answer was immediate. "We will hold the city or die in it." He was given command of the 62nd Army, approximately 54,000 exhausted men facing a German force 5 times their size, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft. That night, under heavy German artillery fire, Zhukov crossed the Volga in a small boat, shells exploding in the water around him, spray soaking his uniform. He established his headquarters in a series of bunkers carved into the cliffs on the western bank, close enough to the fighting that he could hear individual rifle shots and smell the smoke. From his position overlooking the burning city, Zhukov made several observations that would revolutionize urban warfare. First, in Stalingrad's ruins, German advantages evaporated. The Wehrmacht's strength lay in combined arms operations, coordinated attacks by tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft across open terrain. But in a city reduced to rubble, where visibility was measured in meters, where every room was a separate battlefield, these tactics failed. Tanks were vulnerable to close-range attack, unable to elevate their guns to engage defenders on upper floors. Artillery couldn't be used without hitting friendly forces. Luftwaffe bombers were useless when Soviet and German soldiers were separated by a wall rather than a no-man's land. Zhukov's doctrine was revolutionary in its simplicity. Hug the enemy. Soviet soldiers would stay as close to German lines as physically possible, within 50 meters, within grenade-throwing distance, sometimes occupying different floors of the same building. This proximity made German artillery and air support unusable. The Luftwaffe couldn't bomb Soviet positions without killing German soldiers. The battle would be fought at intimate range, room by room, with grenades, submachine guns, knives, and entrenching tools. Second, defense in urban terrain required aggression, not passivity. Zhukov ordered his units to practice active defense, constant counterattacks, raids, and probing actions that kept the Germans off balance. If the enemy took a building in the morning, retake it at night. Never let them consolidate. Never let them rest. Turn Stalingrad into a meat grinder that consumed German strength faster than replacements could arrive. Third, exploit the vertical dimension. Buildings weren't just obstacles, they were fortresses. Defenders on upper floors held enormous advantages over attackers advancing from below. Staircases became death traps, easily defended by a handful of grenades and automatic weapons. Rooftops provided observation posts and sniper positions. Basements offered shelter from artillery and concealed movement routes. Finally, survived by making every German advance unbearable. The 62nd Army couldn't win through firepower or numbers. They would win by making every meter, every building, every room cost more than the Germans could afford to pay. Make them pay in time, make them pay in blood, make them pay until their will broke. These principles would transform Stalingrad into Nazi Germany's nightmare.
When German forces pushed into central Stalingrad in early September, they entered a landscape unlike anything in their experience. The city was no longer a city in any recognizable sense. Aerial bombardment and artillery had reduced it to an apocalyptic wasteland of shattered buildings, cratered streets, and mountains of rubble. Smoke hung perpetually in the air, reducing visibility to 50 meters or less. The acrid smell of burning mixed with the sweet, sick stench of decomposing bodies. Water mains were destroyed, leaving stagnant pools breeding disease. Fires burned continuously, their glow turning night into orange twilight. The German advance, which should have been a matter of days, immediately stalled. Panzer units found the rubble-choked streets impassable. When they tried to maneuver around obstacles, Soviet soldiers emerged from basements and cellars to attack them with Molotov cocktails and magnetic mines. A burning Panzer IV or Panzer III became a roadblock that delayed the advance for hours while engineers cleared it away, always under sniper fire, always taking casualties. Infantry advances were nightmarish. Buildings that appeared empty from the most feared Soviet weapons weren't tanks or artillery, but far simpler tools. PPSH-41 submachine guns, with their 71-round drum magazines, provided devastating firepower in close quarters. RGD-33 hand grenades could be rolled through doorways or dropped from upper floors. Molotov cocktails, bottles filled with gasoline, kerosene, and sulfuric acid, turned men into human torches and could brew up a tank if thrown accurately. And then there were the snipers. Soviet marksmen made daylight movement a death sentence. Armed with scoped Mosin Nagant rifles, they positioned themselves in ruins with clear fields of fire, concealed among the rubble, capable of waiting motionless for hours for a single shot. A German soldier who exposed himself for 3 seconds was dead. Officers, identifiable by their uniforms and behavior, were priority targets. Radio operators carrying distinctive equipment were killed first, cutting off communications. Medics wearing Red Cross armbands were not spared. The Soviets reasoned that killing medics increased the psychological burden on survivors, forced to watch their comrades die untreated. The most famous Soviet sniper, Vasily Zaitsev, became a legend during the September fighting. A shepherd from the Ural Mountains who had learned to shoot hunting deer, Zaitsev was credited with killing 225 German soldiers during the battle, though the actual number was likely higher. His method was patient and methodical. Identify high-traffic areas, find concealed positions with good sight lines, wait for targets to present themselves, take one shot, and immediately relocate. German command became so frustrated with his effectiveness that they allegedly sent their own master sniper, SS Standartenführer Heinz Torvald, to hunt him, a duel that may or may not have occurred, but which became the subject of propaganda on both sides, and decades later, films and books. But individual heroics, while morale-boosting, were less important than the systemic transformation of urban combat. By late September, Stalingrad had become a tactical environment that negated every German advantage. Their superior radios were less effective when units were dispersed across hundreds of individual strongpoints. Their tactical air support couldn't distinguish friend from foe in the smoke and rubble. Their armor was reduced to supporting infantry in point-blank firefights, where a single Soviet soldier with a magnetic mine could destroy a tank worth more than 100 soldiers. The Wehrmacht was being dragged into a form of warfare for which it was utterly unprepared and which was consuming it. Amid the chaos, certain locations became legendary symbols of Soviet resistance and German frustration. None was more famous than Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building on Solyechnaya Street, near the center of Stalingrad, overlooking the 9th January Square. It would become the embodiment of everything that made Stalingrad a nightmare for the Wehrmacht. On 27 September 1942, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov led a four-man reconnaissance patrol to investigate a building near the square. The building was occupied by German forces. In a swift nighttime assault, Pavlov's group killed the Germans and secured the structure. Realizing its tactical value, the building dominated the square and provided clear fields of fire in three directions. Pavlov radioed his company commander, "We're holding this position." Over the next 48 hours, reinforcements arrived: a machine gun squad, riflemen, an anti-tank rifle team, a mortar crew, eventually bringing the garrison to about 30 men. They were a microcosm of the Soviet Union: Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Uzbeks, Jews, Tatars, united by the knowledge that they were probably going to die, but determined to make the Germans pay. Under Pavlov's direction, the building was transformed into a fortress. Windows facing German positions were bricked up entirely, except for narrow firing slits that gave defenders cover while allowing them to shoot out. Interior walls were punched through, creating concealed movement routes so defenders could shift positions without exposing themselves. Furniture, rubble, and anything available was used to create internal barricades. The basement became the command post, protected by several feet of concrete from artillery. A communications trench was dug, mostly at night, under fire, connecting Pavlov's house to Soviet lines along the Volga, allowing resupply and reinforcement. The roof became a sniper's nest and forward observation post. Soviet artillery officers watching from Pavlov's roof. One Private Nikolai Mikhailov later recalled, "We called our basement the fortress within the fortress. German shells would hit the upper floors and dust would pour down on us, but the ceiling held. We had one rule: never show yourself in the same position twice. Fire 3 shots, move to another room. Throw a grenade, change floors. The fascists couldn't predict where we'd be." The defenders developed sophisticated tactics. Anti-tank rifle teams, armed with PTR-D-41 rifles firing 14.5 mm armor-piercing rounds, positioned themselves to hit German tanks in their vulnerable side and rear armor. Machine gunners created interlocking fields of fire that turned the square into a killing zone. Snipers on the roof picked off German officers and NCOs, decapitating enemy leadership. And when the Germans finally breached the building, which happened several times, Soviet counterattacks, launched from the basement through interior passages, would clear them out in savage close-quarters fighting. The psychological impact on German forces was immense. Pavlov's house became a symbol of the impossible, a single building that defied an entire army. German soldiers began to view it with a mixture of frustration and superstitious dread. Officers who ordered attacks on the position knew they were sentencing men to death for questionable tactical gain. One German lieutenant wrote home, "That damned house has swallowed a company. Every attack is the same. We advance across the square, machine guns and rifles from every window. Our tanks shoot walls to rubble. We get inside, then grenades from every direction, Russians appearing from nowhere. We retreat, count our dead, and headquarters orders another attack tomorrow. I don't know who's crazier, the Russians for holding it or us for attacking it." When the battle finally ended in February 1943, Pavlov's house still stood, a shattered skeleton, barely recognizable as a building, but unconquered. Vasily Zhukov would later remark, with some propagandistic exaggeration but essential truth, that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they lost taking Paris. The building became a symbol that appeared in Soviet propaganda, was mentioned in orders of the day, and inspired defenders across the city. If 30 men in one building could hold for 2 months, what couldn't the Red Army accomplish? Today, the building still stands in Volgograd, as Stalingrad was later renamed, fully restored, with a memorial wall listing the names of its defenders. It remains a monument to what urban defense could achieve and a reminder of the nightmare that Stalingrad became for the Wehrmacht. As autumn brought freezing rains that turned rubble into mud, the battle shifted north to Stalingrad's industrial district, 3 massive factory complexes that would become the scene of some of the most brutal fighting in military history: the Barakati Gun Factory, Red October Steel Plant, and Dzerzhinsky Tractor Works. These were not merely buildings, but sprawling industrial labyrinths covering square kilometers. Before the war, they had employed tens of thousands of workers, producing T-34 tanks, artillery pieces, and steel. Now they produced only death. The factory's massive construction, concrete walls several feet thick, steel beams and machinery that couldn't be destroyed even by artillery, made them almost impregnable. But their size and complexity also made them nightmarishly difficult to defend. A single factory might have dozens of workshops, hundreds of rooms, kilometers of corridors, multiple levels above and below ground, networks of utility tunnels, railway sidings, and crane systems overhead. In late September, Paulus committed his reserves to taking the factory district, convinced that one final push would break Soviet resistance. The 389th Infantry Division, 24th Panzer Division, 100 Jaeger Division, and elements of several other formations were thrown into the assault. What followed was fighting of unparalleled intensity and horror. Soviet defenders, factory workers fighting alongside soldiers, had transformed each complex into a fortress. Burgists became bunkers, assembly lines became trenches, blast furnaces, some still radiating residual heat from their last loads, provided warmth in the freezing nights. Overhead cranes became firing positions for snipers and machine gunners who could shoot down on attackers from above. Underground tunnels allowed concealed movement between buildings. The Germans attacked with flamethrowers, engineers, tanks, and artillery. They would capture a workshop in the morning after hours of fighting.
German and Soviet soldiers fought on different floors of the same building, separated by concrete ceilings that shook continuously with grenades and submachine gun fire. One Soviet lieutenant, Anatoly Mereshko, later provided a haunting account. "We were fighting in what had been the foundry. There were vats of molten metal, already cooling but still hot enough to burn. Men fell in during the fighting, thrown by explosions, shot and falling backward, or pushed in close combat. The screams lasted only seconds, but we heard them in our sleep for years afterward. The smell of burning flesh mixed with cordite and concrete dust. That's what I remember about Red October, the smell." The fighting was so intense that units were ground down to fragments within days. The German 24th Panzer Division, which had begun the battle with over 14,000 men and hundreds of tanks, was reduced to fewer than 2,000 combat effectives and 30 operational vehicles by late October. The division was effectively destroyed, but remained in the line because there were no replacements. Similarly, Soviet divisions were fed into the factories, consumed in days of fighting, and replaced by fresh units ferried across the Volga at night. Soviet reinforcements faced their own nightmare, the Volga crossing. Every night, boats, barges, and improvised rafts carried men, ammunition, and supplies across the river under German artillery fire. The river was over a kilometer wide at Stalingrad, offering no cover. German artillery batteries on the western bank, firing by sound and muzzle flash, scored frequent hits. Boats exploded or capsized, spilling their human cargo into the freezing water. Many soldiers drowned, weighed down with equipment, unable to swim in the darkness. Those who reached the western bank were immediately sent into combat, often dying before they learned their comrades' names. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was estimated at 24 hours. For newly arrived soldiers, sent directly into the factory fighting, it was less.
One Soviet colonel stated matter-of-factly, "A division crosses the Volga with 10,000 men. 3 days later, it has 2,000 effectives. A week later, it must be withdrawn and rebuilt." Yet the Soviets held. Barely, by centimeters, but they held. And while Paulus focused obsessively on taking the factories, convinced that victory was just one more attack away, Marshal Georgy Zhukov was planning something that would transform the entire strategic situation. Operation Uranus. While German soldiers fought and died in Stalingrad's ruins, the broader strategic situation was shifting catastrophically against them. The obsessive focus on taking the city had blinded German command to a fundamental vulnerability. Their flanks were held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian divisions, Germany's allies, poorly equipped, under strength, spread thin across hundreds of kilometers, and with questionable morale. Marshal Zhukov, observing the German fixation on Stalingrad, recognized the opportunity. If massive Soviet forces struck the vulnerable flanks simultaneously, they could encircle the entire Sixth Army. The operation, codenamed Uranus, would require secrecy, coordination, and reserves on a massive scale. Throughout October and early November, Soviet forces assembled in hidden positions. Over 1 million men, 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and 1,400 aircraft. The Germans suspected nothing. Reconnaissance flights reported increased Soviet activity, but German intelligence dismissed it as defensive preparations. On November 19, 1942, at 7:30 a.m., Soviet artillery opened fire along a front stretching over 250 kilometers. The barrage was apocalyptic, thousands of guns firing simultaneously, saturating Romanian positions with high explosive and fragmentation shells. Romanian units, already demoralized and inadequately supplied, disintegrated under the onslaught. By afternoon, Soviet tank columns were pouring through the gaps, driving deep into the German rear. The next day, 20th November, Soviet forces struck from the south with equal force. Again, Romanian defenses collapsed. Soviet tanks, primarily T-34s, and some American-supplied M4 Shermans, raced westward, bypassing centers of resistance, driving toward a single objective, the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. On 22nd November, the two Soviet pincers met near Kalach. The trap was closed. The Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, including Romanian and Croatian units, was encircled in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers east to west and 40 kilometers north to south. In Stalingrad itself, German soldiers continued fighting for factories and streets, unaware that they were already trapped. Paulus, stunned by the sudden reversal, requested permission to break out westward while there was still time. Hitler's response was immediate and unequivocal. No, the Sixth Army would hold its positions. Stalingrad would not be abandoned. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, made a
Frostbite became epidemic. Soldiers lost toes, fingers, ears, noses to the cold. Thousands suffered such severe frostbite that amputation was necessary, but medical supplies had run out. Surgeons performed operations without anesthesia, holding screaming patients down while they sawed through frozen limbs. Many died from shock or subsequent infections. But worse than the cold was the hunger. The Luftwaffe's aerial supply effort was failing catastrophically. On good days, perhaps 100 tons of supplies reached the pocket, 1/5 of what was needed. Many days, weather or Soviet fighters prevented any flights. Horses were slaughtered and eaten, their frozen flesh hacked apart with axes and pickaxes. When the horses were gone, soldiers hunted rats in the ruins. Rations were reduced to starvation levels, 200 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life, let alone combat effectiveness.
The combination of cold and starvation was lethal. Bodies too weak from hunger couldn't generate heat. Soldiers froze to death in their positions, discovered at dawn stiff and blue, still clutching weapons. Thousands died this way, not from Soviet bullets, but from exposure and starvation. In Stalingrad's ruins, the nightmare continued. Soviet forces, sensing victory, increased pressure. They had been reinforced with fresh divisions, while the Germans grew weaker daily. The 62nd Army, which had clung desperately to a narrow strip along the Volga in September, now counterattacked, pushing German forces back from the river, reclaiming factories, workshops, and streets purchased with so much blood. German soldiers, now fighting for survival rather than victory, defended their positions with desperate courage. But courage couldn't overcome empty stomachs and frozen bodies. Units dissolved, command structures broke down. Officers who attempted to enforce discipline were sometimes shot by their own men. Surrenders increased, though Hitler had forbidden it and made clear that families of soldiers who surrendered would face consequences. On 8 January 1943, the Red Army offered terms. Surrender, and soldiers would be fed, warmed, and treated humanely according to the laws of war. Paulus, still bound by Hitler's orders, refused. The Red Army attacked. Operation Ring, the final destruction of the pocket, began on 10 January with an artillery bombardment that consumed over 1 million shells in a few hours. Soviet infantry and tanks advanced, crushing German positions, shrinking the pocket systematically. By late January, the pocket had been split in two. All organized resistance was collapsing. German soldiers huddled in cellars, burning furniture for warmth when they had the strength, eating anything organic, wallpaper paste, leather belts, boot soles. Some lost their minds, wandering the ruins, talking to themselves or to the frozen corpses that littered every street. On 30th January, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. It was an implicit order to commit suicide rather than face the humiliation of capture. Paulus, broken and disillusioned, refused. On 31st January, Soviet troops stormed his headquarters in the basement of the Univermag department store. Paulus surrendered along with his staff. The southern pocket ceased to exist. The northern pocket held for 2 more days before collapsing on 2 February 1943. Of the 250,000 men encircled in November, only 90,000 survived to become prisoners. Of those, barely 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died in Soviet prison camps from typhus, dysentery, starvation, and the after-effects of the frozen hell they had endured. Soviet casualties were equally horrific. The Red Army suffered over 1.1 million killed, wounded, and missing during the 5-month battle. Civilian deaths exceeded 40,000 in the initial bombing, with thousands more dying during the battle. In total, perhaps 2 million people died in and around Stalingrad between August 1942 and February 1943. The city itself was unrecognizable. Aerial photographs showed a lunar landscape, craters, rubble, skeletal buildings, nothing else. 99% of structures were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. It would take years to clear the rubble, decades to rebuild. But the strategic and psychological impact transcended statistics. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. For the first time, an entire German army had been destroyed, not merely defeated, but annihilated. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements took heart. In Germany, morale collapsed. Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. The German public, fed years of propaganda about inevitable victory, began to doubt. For the Wehrmacht, Stalingrad's lessons were devastating. The vaunted blitzkrieg doctrine, perfected in Poland and France, had proven useless in urban terrain. Combined arms coordination failed when the battlefield was reduced to room-by-room fighting. Air superiority meant nothing when friend and foe were separated by walls rather than open ground. German tactical flexibility and superior training were negated by an enemy willing to fight at intimate range, who turned every building into a fortress, who counterattacked relentlessly, who made every meter cost more than the Germans could afford. The Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats, had exposed a fundamental vulnerability in Wehrmacht doctrine. When forced to fight on unfavorable terrain under conditions that negated their advantages, German forces could be beaten. The Red Army learned these lessons well. From Stalingrad forward, they would use urban terrain to their advantage, forcing the Germans into close-quarters battles in cities like Kharkov, Kiev, and eventually Berlin itself. Vasily Zhukov survived the battle and was promoted, eventually commanding Soviet forces that accepted Berlin's surrender in May 1945.